The point of order is withdrawn. Mr. Schaefer, you can try again.
Is the motorcycle gang bill?
Mr. Schaefer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I see Mr. Anchia back there, ready for a point of order, perhaps.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
Thank you.
The simple truth is that the ongoing acts of aggression by violent transnational criminal cartels are putting the lives of Texans and Americans in imminent danger. How many more people will die from fentanyl poisoning? How many more landowners will suffer damage to property from trespassers and smugglers? How many more women and children will be sexually abused and exploited? How long will people who have lost the peaceful use and enjoyment of their own property along the border suffer that deprivation? How much longer will we cede the sovereignty of the Texas border to violent cartels who treat migrants like merchandise and commit countless homicides by fentanyl poisoning? Texas must do everything we can to stop the cartels from pumping poison into our neighborhoods. But we cannot effectively address fentanyl smuggling when our limited numbers of law enforcement personnel are processing tens of thousands of people who are illegally crossing the border. We must bring order in between the ports of entry. House Bill 20 invokes the self-defense powers of the states under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution of the United States. House Bill 20 will empower the governor of Texas with legal authorities to actually deter and repel people who are attempting to illegally cross into Texas. And when people have been actually observed crossing the border illegally, the governor, in a manner consistent with the United States Constitution, will be empowered to return them to Mexico and give them instructions to go to the port of entry. HB20 establishes a border protection unit to unify the border security mission and in time relieve the strain on the Texas National Guard, Highway Patrol, and game wardens. The serious nature of the fentanyl crisis cannot be overstated. Members, did you know that today happens to be National Fentanyl Awareness Day? And the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency put out a press release. They talked about how fentanyl poses the greatest threat to national security, health, and safety of the American people. They have a memorial in Washington that shows the faces of people who have died from fentanyl poisoning. It reflects the reality that fentanyl is killing Americans from all walks of life in every state and community in this country. The youngest person on the wall is 17 months old. The oldest is 70 years old. Here's a quote from DEA Administrator Ann Milgram. "Fentanyl is the greatest threat to Americans today. It kills more Americans between the ages of 18 to 45 than terrorism, car accidents, than cancer, than COVID. It kills nearly 200 Americans every day. And the number of children under 14 dying from fentanyl poisoning has increased at an alarming rate. The two drug cartels responsible for bringing fentanyl into the United States, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, are intentionally driving addiction by selling fake pills and hiding fentanyl and other drugs. And they are reaching our kids through using social media platforms. I encourage you today to use this opportunity to talk to your children and your families about what's happening. The fact is, one pill can kill. And the fact is that when we have tens of thousands of people dying and tens of thousands of people crossing the border illegally, our limited law enforcement resources cannot effectively address the fentanyl that is coming into the state of Texas. Let me share a quote. "It makes sense that no great nation can be in a position where they can't control their borders. It matters how you control your borders, not just for immigration, but for drugs, terror, a whole range of other things. That quote is from Joe Biden in August of 2007. Share another quote. Immigration is tough. It always has been, because on the one hand, I think we are naturally a people that wants to help others. And we see tragedy and hardship in families that are desperately trying to get here so that their kids are safe. At the same time, we're a nation state. We have borders. The idea that we can just have open borders is something that is, as a practical matter, unsustainable. Barack Obama, September 2021.
The gentleman will confine his remarks to the bill and refrain from engaging in personalities.
We yield for some questions.
Mr. Anchier, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions, please?
The gentleman
yield
yields
for
for
some
questions.
Thank you. I appreciate your quotes. I don't think anybody in this body disagrees with them. It's really the details of your bill that we want to dive into. So I want to ask you some questions about real life scenarios. So if you don't mind turning to section 411 spot 559B of your bill.
What page are you on?
I'm not sure that we might have the same pages. Mine is in legal and it's on page 15. And the caption there is authority of officers.
Okay.
And I think the concept, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a commissioned or non-commissioned officer of the unit may, to the extent consistent with the United States and Texas Constitution, arrest, apprehend, or detain persons crossing the U.S.-Mexico border unlawfully and deter persons attempting to cross the border unlawfully, including with the use of non-deadly crowd control measures. Did I read that correctly?
I believe that's basically an accurate reading.
So I'd like to understand in better detail how that would operate. How would one of these volunteers deter someone attempting to cross the border unlawfully?
Well, they're not volunteers. They are employees. They are non-commissioned officers.
How would they deter somebody from coming across the border
I'm answering your
unlawfully?
question, Mr. Anchia. They are not volunteers. They are non-commissioned officers under the authority of the governor, the authority of the Department of Public Safety.
I didn't ask about authority.
I'll get to your answer.
What I wanted to get to is how would they deter someone attempting to cross the border unlawfully?
I think there are a number of ways that might occur. Sometimes it could be physical barriers, but ultimately it depends on the facts on the ground.
So you use specific language there that describes non-deadly crowd control measures. Does that include tear gas?
Just a few days ago in El Paso.
Does it include tear gas?
Representative Anchia, I'm answering your question.
Okay.
Just a few days ago in El Paso, rocks were being thrown at the Border Patrol. And the way that they protected themselves was to use tear gas.
Would the BPU be able to use tear gas?
I think if the facts warranted that, they could.
Okay. Would they be able to use beanbag projectiles? Would the BPU be able to use beanbag projectiles?
I don't know.
Would they be able to use horses or ropes?
I think it's going to depend on the facts on the ground. I think that we're going to make sure that Texans are protected and that the officers are able to protect themselves. And in the specific case that I just mentioned,
so same answer on
the rocks were being thrown at the officers,
projectiles
and so the
and
officers
horses and ropes.
used a crowd control measure to protect themselves.
Okay. So now let's turn to section 411-564 on page 18, and that's entitled, and if we have the same page number, it's entitled Article 1, Section 10, Invocation. Okay. Now, there it talks about the circumstances under which a unit chief and director may order the unit and the department to, quote, deter, repel persons attempting to enter the state unlawfully at locations other than ports of entry. How would a member of the unit deter a person from attempting to enter unlawfully?
I think that's going to be based on the facts on the ground, the terrain, the geography.
How would a member of the unit repel a person from attempting to enter the unit? Would that involve, for example, physically pushing them back into the river? Is that how they would deter someone from entering Texas
They are going
unlawfully?
to,
Would
they are
that,
going
would
to
that
use
be within the
measures that are
parameters?
appropriate for the situation.
I'm sorry?
There's over 1,200 miles of border. There's various terrain, various situations, and I think you're going to allow the officers on the ground to make a decision about what might be effective.
And that could include pushing them back into the river.
Those are
Is
your
that
words.
Right? All right.
Those are your words.
So you do not want to answer that question? Is that? How about returning aliens to Mexico who have been observed actually crossing the Texas-Mexico border unlawfully and were apprehended, detained, or arrested in the vicinity of the Texas-Mexico border? How would a member of the unit return aliens to Mexico? This is the BPU.
Humanely and professionally.
I'm sorry?
Humanely and professionally.
Okay, but how? Sort of, physically? Would they put them in a truck? Again, I'm trying to understand your intent here. What would you permit them to do in your bill?
We are legislators. We are not the executive who implements. And so what we will do is we will give guidance in law to the governor, just as we do in many other scenarios.
And what guidance would you give them on what the parameters of your bill is?
And so we're not getting a lot. Mr. Speaker, if he's going to talk over me. If you're going to talk over me, we can't have a conversation.
So what kind of guidance would you give as the bill author as to your intent?
The language that's in the bill.
Okay. And so I'm asking about that specific language in the bill. I understand you may not want to answer it, but how would a member of the unit return aliens to Mexico? How would that sort of physically happen?
I think it would be up to the officers on the ground to determine, based on the geography, the situation, coordination with local law enforcement, how that would be conducted.
Okay, let's talk about how an officer becomes a member of the BPU. And this is in your bill, section 411-5555. What are the requirements to become a member in your bill?
A member of?
The BPU.
So that'll be a mixture of licensed peace officers and non-commissioned officers. So some will have to have a peace officer's license, as is already outlined in state law.
But what is the requirement under your bill? You said some of them, but are there minimum requirements that you put in your bill for how one would be a member of the BPU?
You can look at section 411.561, qualifications and standards. So must hold a peace officer license and meet any other qualifications set by the commission. And there are a number of things that the commission routinely requires of officers as far as code of conduct, standards, and things like that.
So you would defer to the commission on that front?
On the qualifications.
Okay. And what does it mean to be a member of the BPU? Will this person be considered an employee, staff, personnel, or volunteer? And I think you answered that. You said these will be employees, right?
They're going to be paid through the state of Texas.
Okay, so members will be paid. All right, let's look really quickly at section 411-5557 on page 11. And that says that the BPU chief, quote, shall employ as necessary commissioned and non-commissioned officers and other employees to perform unit and operation functions, end quote. Did I read that correctly?
Sorry, Mr. Onchi, will you refer again to the section?
Sorry, 411-5557.
What page are you on?
It's on page 11.
On page what?
11.
Section 7?
Yes, sir. So in that section, what does employ mean?
Person who's employed by the department.
Does that mean
by the commission?
Okay, they are hired, they are employees. What does perform unit operations mean for commissioned and non-commissioned officers? Perform unit operations.
It's a general statement. It might be someone who is performing an administrative function. It might be someone who's performing a logistics function or computer technology. It runs the gamut.
Okay, so that's a broad term. It's not defined in the bill, right?
What is not a broad?
Sorry, perform unit functions. You're construing that broadly. It's not defined in the bill. Is that correct?
Well, the unit has functions that are
that are being performed, right?
that are enumerated at times in the bill.
Okay. So how will they carry out those duties and requirements? Can you provide a couple of examples of how they would carry out those duties and requirements?
Not quite sure what you're looking for, Mr. Anchia.
Some examples of duties or functions that
I think I've already
that they would
stated
be.
some.
I'm sorry?
I've already stated some.
Can you reiterate them, please?
Logistics.
For the benefit of the body?
Logistics, information, technology, etc.
Do you anticipate they would face off with migrants as well?
They might encounter, I don't know, quite frankly.
So
if you're in
your
an
bill
office,
doesn't envision
if you're
them-
sitting in an office, you might encounter any number of persons.
So are most of these jobs office jobs?
That will be up for the department to determine.
Your intent is that you just stated that if you're in an office, you might encounter migrants. So would these BPU members be is your intent that they be members of an office corps, or that they also be out in the field?
That's going to be up to the Border Protection Unit Chief to assign employees to the relevant jobs and tasks that are necessary.
And you would defer to them, and you have no intent on the matter?
The intent is to have licensed peace officers, non-commissioned officers, and other employees as the bill states.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Hinojosa, for purpose.
will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield for
Yes,
questions?
I will yield.
The gentleman yields.
Representative Schaefer, I'm going to ask you in particular several questions on page 15 of your bill, section 411.559. So I just want to give you that heads up so you can
Okay.
be ready for that section. But before we get there, is the purpose of HB20 to enact a state law parallel to the federal immigration law so that Texas can prevent illegal border crossings?
The purpose of HB20 is to assert constitutional authority to secure the state of Texas when people are in imminent danger and tens of thousands of people are dying from fentanyl, and to provide security to local communities that are being overrun.
So then it is the intent for Texas to prevent illegal border crossings under the authority of your bill?
I have
House Bill
stated
20.
the intent. It is to assert authority under the United States Constitution to defend the state of Texas from tens of thousands of people being killed by cartels pumping fentanyl into our neighborhoods,
But
and to bring control to the area in between the ports of entry.
But according to you, if this is federal constitutional authority, then we wouldn't need this bill. So your bill in particular is to prevent illegal border crossings. What you're doing, this is state authorization to prevent illegal border crossings?
This is a constitutional authorization.
Okay. So is the intent then to say that in House Bill 20, Texas Border Protection Unit officers will not operate under the direction or control of federal immigration officers?
That's not what I've stated. We're going to comply with all laws of the United States.
So would they answer to federal immigration officers? The Texas Border Protection Unit that's established by your bill?
They are going to operate consistent with the United States Constitution. The officers and employees of the Border Protection Unit will report to the governor, and the governor will follow the Constitution and the laws of the United States.
So then they will not be under the direction or control of federal immigration officers?
I've given you my answer, Representative Hinojosa.
I know, but you're not answering my question. This
I'm
legitimate
sorry if it
question.
doesn't answer your question.
I just want to know,
I've
are they
given you're trying to get me to say something that's not something I intend to say, and I'm not going to say what you want to say.
Well, I think it's a legitimate question to know, do they answer to federal immigration officers or not?
They will operate consistent with the laws of the United States.
Okay. Well, you're not answering my question, Representative Schaefer. Let me move on to the extent of the authority for the Texas Border Protection Unit. So on page 15, section 411.559, the bill authorization of BPU officers to, quote, arrest, apprehend, detain, or deter persons crossing the Texas-Mexico border unlawfully. BPU officers will determine whether an individual is crossing the border unlawfully. Is that correct?
In a manner consistent with the Constitution.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
I move for an extension of time to further question the
Members,
author.
you've heard the motion. Is there objection? There is objection. This is a division vote. Vote aye, vote nay. Strike the board. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Schaefer voting nay. Have all voted? There being 82 ayes, 52 nays, the motion is adopted. Mr. Schaefer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms.
Representative
Hinojosa,
Schaefer.
for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
I'll yield for some questions.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you. I believe the question that I was asking is, will the BPU officers determine whether an individual is crossing the border unlawfully under your bill?
In a manner consistent with the Constitution, they may do that.
They may do so. They may decide whether. May they also decide under Section 411.559 which people to arrest for illegal border crossing?
They will act in a manner consistent with the Constitution to determine what is necessary as far as what conduct needs to be addressed.
So they will decide then which people to arrest for illegal border crossing? They will have the power of that determination?
They will do so in a manner consistent with the Constitution.
They will decide which people to arrest? Correct.
I've answered your question.
Representative Schaefer, this is a basic question. Do they get to decide who to arrest?
And I told you they're going to, they have the authority to arrest people that they have seen crossing illegally in between the ports of entry in a manner consistent with the Constitution.
Okay. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. Can you just repeat what you just said? I'm sorry, I legitimately couldn't hear. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
The bill gives them the authority.
Okay. And so then when they arrest these people under Section 411.559, the people crossing the Texas-Mexico border, quote, unlawfully, will they be able to hold these people in state custody? Is that correct?
I think they're going to fulfill the operational purpose here, which is to, if the bill states very plainly that if someone is crossing the border illegally in between the ports of entry, then under the certain sections of the bill, under the invasion clause, they would have that authority.
Okay. And so there's another section, or there's another part to Section 411.564 about, quote, returning aliens to Mexico. So BPU officers will decide who to repel or return to Mexico. Is that correct?
I think that you've asked the same question three different ways.
Well, this is about who to before it was about who to arrest, right? But there's also a section about returning, quote,
persons that have been actually observed.
Right, returning aliens to Mexico. That's a quote from the bill. The officers will decide who to repel or return to Mexico. Is that correct?
In a manner consistent with the United States and Texas Constitution, they will deter and repel persons attempting to enter this state unlawfully at locations other than the ports of entry, return aliens to Mexico who have been observed actually crossing the Texas-Mexico border unlawfully and were apprehended, detained, or arrested in the vicinity of the Texas-Mexico border.
So yes. Let me ask, there was an original version of this bill, and in the committee substitute, isn't it correct that the committee substitute removes the language about acting consistently with, quote, federal immigration laws from section 411.564, which grants power to BPU officers to deter, repel, arrest, and return individuals to Mexico after a declaration of invasion or imminent danger?
It wasn't necessary to include that caveat in the substitute because the phrase consistent with the Constitution already requires compliance with federal immigration law. Article 6 of the Constitution, which is the Supremacy Clause, makes federal immigration statutes the supreme law of the land and compels compliance with federal statutes as a matter of constitutional command. So the bill will be interpreted and enforced in a manner consistent not only with the Constitution, but also federal immigration statutes.
Okay. There's a finding on page 2 of the bill, section 1.02. It's a finding of imminent danger. Does the finding of imminent danger in the bill constitute a legislative finding that a state of invasion or imminent danger under section 10, article 1 of the United States Constitution exists that triggers the authority of the BPU chief to order removals of unlawful border crossings?
So the finding in the bill reads that this state is in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay and declares authority under Section 10, Article 1, United States Constitution. And the bill has provisions that outline the powers that exist when that finding has been made.
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
Okay, so that it is your position that that is the trigger under Section 10, Article 1 of the United States Constitution for the authority of the BPU chief to order removal of unlawful border crossings, the findings in this bill, the finding of imminent danger.
Representative Hinojosa, I have to apologize. I didn't hear the beginning of your statement.
Okay. So on page 2 of the bill, there is a finding of imminent danger.
Correct.
So what I would like to know is does that finding of imminent danger constitute a legislative finding that a state of invasion or imminent danger under Section 10, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution exists that triggers the authority of the BPU chief to order removals of unlawful border crossers?
Yes.
Okay. I want to get to the purpose of the bill and the impetus for the bill. In the testimony before the Senate Border Security Committee on March 16, 2023, Attorney General Paxton stated, quote, Arizona has tried to pass laws similar to what the federal government passed, but, quote, unfortunately, the court ruled by saying that the state couldn't step in and pass these laws. Is the purpose of House Bill 20 to enact a state border protection law and challenge the ruling in Arizona v. U.S. that states can't step in and pass these laws?
The purpose of HB20 is to assert the self-defense powers under the U.S. Constitution to unify our state's border security mission to address the imminent danger of tens of thousands of people dying in the country, thousands of people dying in the state of Texas from fentanyl poisoning, fentanyl homicides, and to restore peace and security to the people that live along the border.
And so is it your intention
I'm
to
not
challenge?
I cannot speak to what General Paxton's statements were. You'll have to ask him regarding what his intention is.
But okay, I'm asking you, is it your intention to challenge Arizona v. United States?
My intention is to do just what I stated.
In his testimony before the Senate Border Security Committee on March 16, 2023, Attorney General Paxton also stated that he disagreed with the U.S. Supreme Court in Arizona v. U.S. and, quote, we should do what we can to try and overturn that decision. So are we trying to reverse Arizona v. United States?
The Attorney General is entitled to his opinion. I have stated to you what the my purpose is for this bill.
Okay. He also stated, the only way I know to do this, to challenge Arizona v. US, is to test it. And we got a couple of ideas on how to do that. Your bill, he was referring to Senate Bill 2424 at that time, does that. There will be other ways that we can also test it and find out where the court is and find out what the parameters of that decision are. Again, is the purpose of House Bill 20 to enact a law similar to federal law that will test the preemption principle articulated in Arizona v. United States.
Representative Hinojosa, your question has been asked and it has been answered.
Well, I want to know if it's your intention to challenge this Supreme Court precedent. The other thing that he also said is, quote, we've got different Supreme Court justices and we've got a different court and the best chance we've ever had to overturn that. And that's what I'm wondering. If this legislation is trying to take advantage of the fact that our court has changed and you see an opportunity to
The gentleman's
challenge.
time has expired. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Niave Criado.
The chair recognizes Ms. Niave Criado to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. You know, as legislation and as legislators and in the best state in the country, we often have opportunities to provide solutions to move the ball forward for the people of Texas. And sometimes there are pieces of legislation that will have devastating and massive ramifications for our state. Not just to people with the color of my skin, but for American citizens, for our fellow Texans that reside all across this state. This amendment moves to strike the enacting clause so that we put forth an option, because this legislation is going to create a civilian police force with police powers who will be able to travel through any of our counties, through any of our cities, to set up checkpoints, to question us and question our Americanism without consequence and with immunity. This isn't just a border bill, and while it may be called the Border Protection Unit, the powers that the civilian force is going to have is going to impact our local law enforcement too. And here's why. Imagine whether it's Dallas, Fort Worth, or Houston, the Valley, untrained or individuals who do not have the same training as law enforcement can come, set up checkpoints in our community, and ask individuals, whether they are citizens, regardless of the color of our skin, as our local law enforcement works day and night, our men and women in blue, to build up those community relations. Groups like this can tear those down in a heartbeat. And as we look at what's happening across the state, whether it's hate crimes, whether it is white supremacy, whether it is the, quote, right-wing death squad language that we see tattooed on people's bodies, it is those types of people that we are concerned are going to be signing up for this civilian police force. These civilians under the bill will have the same immunity, qualified immunity that we give to our law enforcement. Law enforcement who goes through training, who go through polygraph exams, who work hard day and night, who have firearms discipline, who know what they're doing, they are experts in their field, who have earned that right to qualified immunity that is under attack. You are now giving this qualified immunity to civilians who do not have the same level of expertise. Law enforcement has voiced these concerns. Law enforcement has tried to talk to the author of the bill. And those concerns have not been taken into account. Not only will this immunity be extended to the civilian force, it will also be extended, the same qualified immunity, to any employee of this new Border Protection Unit. On top of that, this legislation was expanded to create a felony trespass that initially applied to migrants, now applies to United States citizens, a third-degree felony trespass. So as you're crossing from the Oklahoma to Texas border, Louisiana to Texas border, and you cross onto property without the consent of that landowner, American citizens can now be charged with felony trespass under this bill. This legislation also does something that we have not seen done, an attack on DPS, taking away powers from Colonel McCraw, taking powers away from our DPS director, having no oversight by the Department of Public Safety or troopers or men and women who stand in this chamber keeping us safe, taking power away from the Department of Public Safety and giving it to this new Border Protection Unit. The governor, we have seen, is already exercising these powers, doing what he believes is right to address issues that we acknowledge exist, issues that we know we need comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level. We need our federal partners, Republican or Democrat, to come together to pass meaningful immigration reform. And in the meantime, we as a body we are jeopardizing the integrity of DPS by taking away their power for generations to come. We all deserve, whether we've been here for generations or whether we're new to Texas, to live in a Texas free from concern or fear about being stopped by individuals, people like the Minutemen who are going to be patrolling our streets without experience of law enforcement.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Anchir, for what purpose?
will the gentlelady yield for questions?
Will the lady yield for questions?
I yield.
The lady yields.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you've contextualized this well. From a law enforcement perspective, I know you care very much about it. I don't think either you or I or anybody in this chamber would disagree with the quotes that Representative Schaefer offered up about the difficulty of immigration reform and balancing the humanitarian natures, the humanitarian issues that we have before us with the securing of our borders. Is that a fair assessment?
That is.
But what you're saying to the body is, hey, we share those goals, but this is not the way to do it. No law enforcement group, as my understanding, came and testified in favor of this bill. Is that right?
That's correct. In fact, law enforcement dropped cards against. They tried to meet with the author. We have had multiple conversations with different law enforcement individuals about the devastating consequences of this bill.
And in fact, the rank and file at DPS really think highly of Colonel McCraw. And I have heard personally about why are we perverting the chain of command here and taking Colonel McCraw out of the oversight of the BPU or the current border effort. Have you heard the same thing?
We've heard the same thing, and the fact is that our DPS troopers have some of the best training. They are experienced. Our DPS director has experience necessary to do what they are doing, and we are stripping those powers away from DPS to create this new civilian force that does not have the same experience as our DPS now.
And it is the case that Representative Schaefer said, well, some may be retired police officers, some may be retired military, but we saw what a former member of the military, somebody who got kicked out of the military, did in Allen just this week, did we not?
We saw the consequences of that. We see and have tried to highlight the concerns about not having language in here to prevent people like that from joining this force, to prevent people from a history of mental health illness, for example, of joining this force, to prevent people who have in their heart or who would probably fail a polygraph test from joining this force, civilian force. We need people who have law enforcement training who understand the laws on our books and who will follow those laws.
And while the author did mention former military or former police as candidates here, people who have done neither would be eligible to be deputized, essentially be given a badge here to serve in the BPU. Is that not right?
That's correct. And then what uniforms are they going to be wearing? What police vehicles are they going to be using? The language of this bill.
The lady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes Mr. Schaefer in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Gomez, for what purpose?
would the gentleman yield for some questions?
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
Members, I have a higher view of our law enforcement agency. I think the Department of Public Safety is the gold standard for law enforcement in the state of Texas. And in the Texas Administrative Code governing the DPS, let me read you the 10 general orders that are listed and apply to every person in the Department of Public Safety and would apply to every employee of the Border Protection Unit. To execute the mission of the department to protect and serve Texas. To practice at all times the motto of the department, courtesy, service, protection. To keep myself clean and presentable and in good physical, mental, and moral condition. To know and obey at all times the U.S. and state constitutions, federal and state laws, and lawful orders and instructions. To keep all state equipment issued to me fully accounted for in proper working condition and secure. To register as a voter and vote my convictions as a citizen, but refrain from political campaigns and endorsements, except as specifically authorized by law and policy. Conduct my duties in a straightforward, honest, and respectful manner, relying upon poise, competence, and soundness of character. To report misconduct in matters that negatively impact me or other department personnel to my immediate supervisor and higher if necessary. To make suggestions to improve department operations, policies, and services, to conduct myself on and off duty in a manner that merits the voluntary praises of those with whom I come in contact, so that my actions reflect well upon myself, the department, and the state of Texas. That is the motto of the men and women of the Department of Public Safety, and it will be true for the men and women of the Texas Border Protection Unit. And I think we should hold them to that standard, and we should be proud that such men and women would be willing to serve our state. I will yield for some questions.
Ms. Gomez, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman yield for some questions?
The gentleman yields for questions.
Representative Schaefer, I want to thank you so much for indulging us in this extensive discussion. It's, as you can tell, extremely important to the border members and I would hope to this entire body.
I think it's a sobering conversation. I don't think anybody should be happy that we're having to have a bill like this in front of the Texas House, because it shows the serious nature of what is happening. And when tens of thousands of people are dying and property is being destroyed and communities are being overrun and people are scared, quite frankly, then it requires serious conversations.
Make no mistake, we are personally advised and aware of the situation on the border. I live there, my family lives there, my friends, and 250 other thousand constituents live there. So I appreciate the sincerity with which you're addressing this. But I just want to ask you some questions about how this bill, from soup to nuts, on paper it can sound one way, but sometimes we actually don't understand how physically things are going to play out. So if you would help me paint this picture for what exactly it's going to look like, for example, for the residents of Cameron County, where do you envision this border protection unit actually setting up post in Cameron County?
Well, I think the bill calls, I don't think I know the bill calls for the headquarters to be in the border region. And the bill calls on the department to recruit, to the greatest extent possible, people that live in the border region. So I think the officers and non-commissioned officers that you will see will hopefully be people from the community who aren't living in hotels but are living in homes because they either rent or have a mortgage, maybe have their children in the community, and are there to protect the community, and will be positioned along the river in a way to protect the community.
So it's your vision that this unit will only set up along the river, so to speak?
The focus of this operation would be the border region.
So do you envision border protection units, for example, setting up in Cameron Park, a highly Hispanic neighborhood in my district?
I don't have any specific location like a park or anything like that in mind. We're looking at over a 1,200-mile border, and we will leave the deployment of these personnel to the officers in charge.
So the way your bill's written, they are not exclusively required to set up by the river, are they?
Those directions will be made by the officers in charge.
And I guess I'm asking, what is to stop those in charge from sending unit officers to set up posts in Hispanic neighborhoods?
See, I think what you're trying to do with your question is to scare people. But I think what we really need to be focused on is rather than hypotheticals that are extreme, we need to be focused on what's actually happening. People are dying from fentanyl at an alarming rate. When I came into the legislature in 2013, CBP reported that they caught 2 pounds of fentanyl. In 2022, they caught 10,000 pounds. People are dying. And
Mr.
so while
Schaefer,
it may get headlines and it may stir up political passions to throw out extreme hypotheticals, it doesn't get at what the problem really is that the cartels are pumping poison into our communities. And we've got to find a way to bring order and security to our communities so those people in the parks don't have to worry about their child getting some candy that turns out to be laced with fentanyl and kills them. That is what we need to be concerned about.
respectfully, Mr. Schaefer, I'm not sure what about my question stirred passions. I simply asked, what is to prohibit or stop a border protection unit from setting up their post in Hispanic neighborhoods?
Representative, you're going to be focused on the cartel activity
I'm focused on
and
my
the illegal
community,
activity
respectfully.
along the river. If you read the bill, that's the focus, okay? We simply don't have the personnel or the numbers to just be going and setting up out in neighborhoods, okay? The idea is you go where the issue is, and that will be left to the officers in charge who are going to be trained and who are going to be working with local law enforcement. If you will read the bill and the section where it talks about the strategic plan and the coordination and the planning with local law enforcement, the goal of this bill is to coordinate with local law enforcement, to unify the mission, to understand what's going on at the local level.
And respectfully, Mr. Schaefer, I have read your bill, and I guess that's why I'm asking. I didn't see anything in your bill that prohibited these units from setting up posts in Hispanic neighborhoods, of which my constituency consists primarily of. So then I guess since you can't answer that, my second question would be, what type of probable cause, if any, do your border protection unit officers require to stop someone?
They must comply with the laws of the state of Texas and the United States.
So is it your understanding then that they would require probable cause to pull someone over and ask their status?
They're not going to be able to make any kind of an unlawful detention.
Border Protection Unit officers are not going to be able to make any sort of lawful detention?
Unlawful. They're going to follow the law. If it requires probable cause, then that's the standard they will meet.
Okay, so they will require probable cause. Are you aware that when an immigrant, for example, is detained by, for example, Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol, that they are entitled to a credible fear review hearing, what you might refer to as a deportation hearing? Is your bill, the way it's written, going to deny that due process hearing to individuals?
The bill is going to focus on the river, and they will follow the laws, federal immigration laws, and the laws of the Constitution. And whatever process is required, they will be given.
So then it is your understanding, because the way the bill's written, forgive me, it states they can detain and deter. It does not state deter and provide them with a due process review hearing. So it is your vision that they are entitled to this due process credible fear hearing?
We're going to leave whatever process is based on whatever that individual is required under the laws of the United States Constitution will be given.
Okay, so then I can take that away, that they will be entitled to that deportation hearing. Mr. Schaefer, how will your Border Protection Unit determine who in fact is a trespasser in the state of Texas versus a non-trespasser in the state of Texas?
A trespass charge requires that the elements of the trespass statute be followed. So you have to have a person who's going to...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Gomez, for what purpose?
I'd like to move to extend the gentleman's time.
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? There is objection. Members vote aye, vote nay. Division vote. Strike the board. The motion fails. The chair recognizes Ms. Niave Criado to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. The author spoke about DPS being the gold standard. DPS as a gold standard, then why is this legislation taking their power away? If DPS was a gold standard, then why are we removing funds from their budget? If DPS was a gold standard, why are we defunding DPS? If DPS was a gold standard, why are we on page 17, lines 8 through 9, transferring existing personnel, equipment, and facilities to this new civilian unit? The fact is that this legislation shows a flagrant disrespect for DPS, a flagrant attempt to usurp their power and the work that they are already doing, a flagrant attempt to circumvent our Constitution and the Supremacy Clause that preempts Texas from even doing this. So I submit to you, if Texas was the gold standard, if DPS was the gold standard, why is this legislation attacking their integrity? We want DPS to continue. We don't want to take their power. We want individuals who are, if they're going to be taking these actions and if civilians are being given the power of DPS, that they be required to have the training and we get the right people in place. But this is not the solution. This is not the answer.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Will the chairwoman yield
Will the
for
lady yield for questions?
I yield.
The lady yields.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you eloquently making that argument. If, as was stated from the front mic previously, that if they're the gold standard, then why are we perverting the chain of command and pulling GPS leadership out of this bill? I think you made that point eloquently. I want to pivot, however, and talk about a different point, and that is the point that impacts all of our constituencies. The same author of this bill also brought a bill to the floor that permitted, this passed back in 2017, that permitted anyone, any peace officer, for asking any person for immigration status. So if you have this civilian unit that is not trained in engaging with U.S. citizens, they've essentially been deputized for this, and at the same time, they have the ability to not just operate in the U.S.-Mexico border region, but every border region, whether it's Oklahoma, Louisiana, or New Mexico. Can they ask U.S. citizens for their immigration status? If you take the prior SB4 together with this bill, what would prevent them? And I know that the author said that it had to be a lawful stop, but a Terry stop is a lawful stop. We permit them in SB4 to ask immigration status. What in this bill prevents a BPU member from asking a U.S. citizen to show me their papers?
There is nothing that prevents an individual, a civilian who's not going to have the training of law enforcement to still question us as Americans about our citizenship. And it's going to be people like our communities. Imagine checkpoints outside of churches, outside of schools, outside of neighborhoods, whether it's an Asian community in Houston, a Latino community in Dallas or the Valley.
A South Asian community potentially in Tarrant County.
Absolutely.
People who a BPU member might think doesn't look like their vision of somebody who deserves a seat at the American table could be asked to prove their citizenship. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And that is one of the most concerning provisions as well, is the racial profiling that we anticipate is going to happen. And in this climate right now, where the color of your skin, unfortunately, has made communities targets of mass violence and mass shootings, where an individual from North Texas drove to El Paso because language like the words invasion, where people are painting our communities as invaders of this state, when we have been here for generations.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Turner, for what purpose?
Would Representative Niave Criado yield for some questions?
Will the lady yield for questions?
I yield.
The lady yields.
Thank you, Representative. And, in talking about your amendment, when the bill author came to the mic a minute ago to oppose your amendment, he again cited fentanyl as a reason that we should oppose your amendment. But I want to revisit with you a few statistics that we discussed in the State Affairs hearing on this bill and that I asked Mr. Schaefer about. And frankly, I'm disappointed he's continuing to use this talking point. But I'm going to just ask you if you recall these statistics.
I do.
Do you recall that we discussed in that hearing how, according to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, over 90% of fentanyl seizures occur at legal crossings or interior vehicle checkpoints?
That's correct.
And you know that the Cato Institute analyzed this data, and they concluded that the location of smuggling makes sense because hard drugs at ports of entry are about 97% less likely to be stopped than are people crossing illegally between ports of entry. Do you recall that?
I do. And there's data also that shows that it's American citizens, majority American citizens, who are the ones that are bringing the fentanyl over through those ports of entry.
That's exactly right, Representative, and you may recall that that is data from the U.S. Sentencing Commission that says in their quote, I'll ask if you recall this, do you recall their quote that says, a more accurate summary is that fentanyl is overwhelmingly smuggled by United States citizens almost entirely for U.S. citizen customers, as they debunked the myth that migrants are smuggling fentanyl.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested. A record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Canales voting aye. Show Mr. Schaefer voting nay. Show Mr. Vasut voting nay. Show Mr. Wilson voting nay. Show Mr. Members, you may vote for your desk. We will give you time. Have all voted? There being 61 ayes, 84 nays, the amendment fails.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
I raise a point of order against further consideration of the committee substitute to House Bill 20 in that it violates House Rule 8, Section 1 and Section 3, in that the bill contains more than one subject and that the caption fails to give reasonable notice of the subject of the proposed measure.
Please bring your point of order down front.
Mr. Anchia raises a point of order against further consideration of House Bill 20 under Rule 8, Sections 1 and 3, on the grounds that the caption does not give reasonable notice of the bill's contents, and the bill has more than one subject. The bill contains a finding that this state is in such imminent danger as it will not admit of delay and declares authority under Section 10, Article 1 of the United States Constitution. The bill also authorizes the governor to invoke these same constitutional provisions and issue a unilateral declaration, the state of invasion or imminent danger under Section 10, Article 1 of the United States Constitution exists. It then direct the proposed Border Protection Unit to use force to deter and repel certain persons entering Texas. Mr. Schaefer argues that the invocation and authorization are merely general statements of an existing right of self-defense. Under Section 10, Article 1 of the United States Constitution, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. The bill's invocation of this authority is an express declaration of war under the long-dormant war power reserved to the states. The bill likewise authorizes the governor to issue a declaration of war if he finds that either condition authorized by the U.S. Constitution exists, and then deploy state resources to prosecute that war. The plain meaning of the term war includes more than self-defense activity. Mr. Schaefer does not offer any contrary authority to support his interpretation. Declarations of war under an obscure provision of the federal Constitution are precisely the subject matter that must be stated in the caption of the bill, essentially concerned only with law enforcement activity in the state's border region. And because domestic law enforcement is not the same kind, degree, or type of activity as that of war, the caption does not give reasonable notice of the bill's content, and the bill is also impermissibly containing two subjects. Accordingly, the point of order is well taken and sustained. The chair lays out on second reading HB 800. The clerk read the bill.